Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Carol Phillips was born on the Caribbean island of St. Kitts and brought up in the north of England in Leeds, Yorkshire. Since 1985, he's published 10 novels and several works of nonfiction, a number of them dealing with the African slave trade. His novel Crossing the River was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and he won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for A Distant Shore. His latest work, A View of the Empire at Sunset, is an evocation of the early life of novelist Jean Rhys, which coincided with the final days of the British Empire. It's published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and I'm very pleased that it brings Carol Phillips to our show now. Hello, Cass.
Hi.
Where is St. Kitts? Is it Dominica, where Jean Rhys grew
people
up?
get confused because of the Dominican Republic, which has a different pronunciation, and Dominica, and often people in Dominica will tell you that all their mail goes to the Dominican Republic, and they have to, So Dominica is to the south. It's near St. Lucia, Barbados. St. Kitts is a little bit further north, near Antigua, near the Virgin Islands, and so they're similarly small islands. All those Caribbean islands are relatively small, but Dominica is, a good few hundred miles to the south.
Are they both still part of the British Commonwealth?
Dominica is a republic. It's actually very unusual in the Caribbean in that it not only gained independence, but it also decided it didn't want to be a part of the extended, imagined British family. St. Kitts is a part of the Commonwealth, yes.
And your parents moved to Leeds in the north of England when you were still a baby because World War II led to a kind of a dearth of workers?
Exactly.
They need to fill jobs?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people don't really understand that the migration that happened from Commonwealth areas like India, Pakistan, the Caribbean, to a certain extent Africa, was not just people from those regions wanting to go to England to better themselves and better their lives, which is fair enough, but it was also a pull. Britain appealed to colonial subjects to come and help.
Very different from the situation today.
Oh,
well, was there resentment against the new immigrants?
Well, it's not different. Well, it's actually that's a good point. It's different in one sense in that Britain isn't appealing to anybody to come and help out these days, but what is similar is the degree of resentment on the arrival of people who were discernibly non-British.
Although I remember when I lived in England in 1960-61, people said things like, "Oh, those darn Packies." I don't know whether you was there a Caribbean community in Leeds?
Oh yeah, it's quite a large one. I mean, people from the Caribbean or from India or Pakistan or wherever tended to go where their relatives had gone. And the question one has to ask oneself is, why did the first people go to that city? And it's usually connected with industry. If you are riding around on a small train loading up sugar cane in a cane field and you're a labourer and it says on the side made in Leeds or made in Manchester, then that becomes your understanding of what England is. So when you arrive in England, you want to go to Leeds or Manchester. So people tended to go to the industrial places, not just because there were jobs there, but because there was also some understanding even before you'd left your colony that this was a place to, make a pilgrimage towards.
How old were you when you went to St. Kitts?
As an adult?
Well, did you go back as a child?
No, we couldn't afford to go. I mean, as kids, we were my family didn't have, they were a working class family. We didn't have the money to have holidays abroad.
But you did go to Oxford, which isn't bad.
That was later, and that was, that was school, that was studying hard. But, the more problematic aspect of growing up in England at that time was it was a time when British people were beginning to go to Spain and France on holidays, So rather than saying, well, I went to Blackpool, or I went to Bournemouth, or I went to some English seaside town, the fancier kids would say, well, I went to Spain on a package holiday, or to France. The idea of anybody flying across the Atlantic was about as plausible as anybody going to Mars or the moon today. So we didn't have the money, but we also didn't have the imagination to imagine that we could go to the Caribbean.
Your first novel, The Final Passage, tells the story of a young woman who leaves her home in the Caribbean to start a new life with her husband and baby in London in the 1950s. Have you always felt comfortable writing about women as your protagonists?
Well, it's never really struck me as a problem. Obviously, today, as you know as well as I do, there's a strong kind of politically correct lobby which tends to stand on the fringes of literature, telling people what they should and shouldn't do and where they should and shouldn't imagine. To me, it's fundamentally moronic.
The whole idea of fiction is putting yourself into somebody else's mind.
Yeah, that's your job, is to imagine yourself into the lives of people that are not you, and sometimes those people are a different class, a different race, a different gender, a different generation. That's your job. So, but with women, no, I guess because I was largely brought up by my mother and surrounded by aunts, and it never struck me as odd to try to imagine the world through the eyes of a woman.
When did you first become aware of Jean Rhys? When did you first read her?
I think after university, which is probably quite an odd thing to say because I was studying English literature, and she's now very much recognized as a pillar in the English canon. But I didn't really come across her. I think largely because she was still alive when I was, she died in 1979, which was the year I graduated from university, and at Oxford, you were not allowed to study people who were still alive.
She was fairly old. She was 89 years old at the time. She was
sure, but still breathing.
Yeah. She was no. I mean, she lived a long, complicated life.
Yeah.
She was born in 1890, raised in Dominica, and she was the daughter of a white Creole mother and a Welsh father.
Yeah, yeah.
He was a doctor, and you describe her as caught somewhere between colored and white. Did she feel alienated from both communities?
I think, like a lot of white colonial families, she went back 5-6 generations on her mother's side as a West Indian, albeit a white West Indian.
So she was really light-skinned.
She was blonde, light-skinned, could pass. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess that would be the term in the context of the United States. You say she could easily pass. Mm-hmm. The only problem would be when she opened her mouth, because she had a very strong West Indian accent. So she spoke more like Bob Marley than she did like the Queen. But when you looked at her, you'd think, she's just a Shirley Temple lookalike.
That affected her when she tried to get into show business, because there weren't too many roles for white women who sounded like Bob Marley.
No, they particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, they were quite happy with her ability to dance and perform and masquerade, but essentially it became very much a matter of keep your mouth shut, because every time you open your mouth you betray yourself. So stay at the back of the stage, be a part of the chorus, don't try to get above yourself, all of which obviously feeds into a person's sense of insecurity.
Although your racial identity is different from hers, and actually your life stories, to what extent do you think that your shared Caribbean backgrounds gave you insight into her as a character you'd want to write about?
Well, I think the fact that she migrated is very important. The fact that she came from the Caribbean and she came to England, and she came to England at a vulnerable age at 16. I came as a baby, but I still understood that at the back of my head somewhere was a mythical sense of home. Maybe a home I could never reattach myself to.
And did you feel any attachment to it when you did go to St. Kitts?
Well, when I eventually went, I was 22, and I think by that stage I'd got over the anxiety of needing another home, but I still wanted to understand a part of me that was hidden. And I think for her, it wasn't hidden because she came at 16, but the grief and the small insults and the aggressions that she was suffering in England meant that she always began to regard home, or this notion of home, as a place of refuge against what she was suffering in England.
She lived a rather complicated life before she became a famous writer. She had a career as a showgirl, as you mentioned. She was briefly a prostitute, had an abortion paid for by an ex-lover, had 3 disastrous marriages, and then there was her alcoholism.
It's a regular life, Lenny.
She was an alcoholic. She had a time in Holloway prison for assault and short stays in asylums.
So what are we saying here? We're saying it was a life full of incident. I mean, basically, if that was a man we were talking about, we would be thinking, oh my, I mean, this is quite an extraordinary, turbulent, tempestuous life. How on earth did this man survive that? Being a woman, I think, makes it extraordinary, actually, that she suffered this degree of turbulence, this degree of disquiet and unease, and yet somehow still managed to write.
But you've chosen to write about her as a novel. So how much is what you have written about as her early years before she became a famous writer, how much of it is based on fact? How much of it is from your imagination?
All of it. I mean, the factual details about her life, how old she is, where she did what, at what age, where she lived, everything is factual. What's imaginative is what she was feeling, because that's what you can never really document.
Well, I was wondering about the life. Her name, her birth name was Ella Gwendolyn Rees Williams. Mm-hmm. You call her Gwendolyn Williams throughout the book. But wasn't she called Ella during her lifetime?
She was called Ella. She was called Gwen. Some people knew her as Jean, which was her pen name. But that's part of the treacherous nature of migration. We know the story of migration in this country. We know the story of migration generally. It usually involves changing your name, either at Ellis Island or at some port of entry because somebody can't spell properly or pronounce properly, or you seize the opportunity to bestow a new identity upon yourself. She was no different. So her name was very flexible. Her identity was very flexible around her name.
And you call her Gwen in a way almost creating the protagonist of a novel.
Gwen was what those who really knew her called her. You know, you know what it's like with some sports people or actors. We know them as one name, but when you get closer and closer to them, you suddenly realize they have another nickname that everybody knows them as that, and it suggests an intimacy. And Gwen was the name by which those who were effectively sleeping with her knew her by. So that suggests an intimacy. Nobody who slept with her called her Jean.
Uh-huh. She had a difficult relationship with her mother. Was she closer to her father?
Very much so.
But the relationship with her mother affected her life in a pretty big way. I
sense a huge interstate highway to Freud here.
Well, her mother arranged for her to leave Dominica when she was 16 years old.
Her relationship
Did she want to go?
No. She didn't want to leave. Mothers can be very fearful of what's going to happen to their children, and I guess in a colonial context, we're talking about a Victorian era. A young girl who's beginning to act out and beginning to identify with the black servants and beginning to speak with a slightly black accent is probably terrifying to a young woman mother, a young mother, who is trying to hold on to the proprietorial standards of empire, which means you do not treat the black servants as though they're somehow kin and close to you. You do not speak with an accent which suggests you're dropping your H's and beginning to sound like Bob Marley. So I expect to her mother she was quite a terrifying young girl.
You've called your book A View of the Empire at Sunset. So was the empire already starting to go into its sunset? Because as far as my sense of the British Empire ending, it's somewhere around the late 1940s, early 1950s.
Oh, you're absolutely right. In terms of historical memory, the Suez Crisis of 1956 probably signals the time when we can say it's all over. Although, here we are, we're sitting together in a studio in New York in 2018, and we could plausibly argue that somebody's trying to breathe life into the empire again as we speak with Brexit going on. But at the beginning of the 20th century, I think there was not really any sense that there was going to be a decline in the empire. But with hindsight, which is always 2020, I think we can look back and see that some of the problems were already sewn into the decline of the empire at that stage.
I'm speaking with Carol Phillips, whose latest novel, From Farrar, Straus and Giroux, is A View of the Empire at Sunset. So she came to England, and her schoolmates insulted her and taunted her, all just because of her accent?
Because of her accent, and because it's like the new kid at school. The new kid at school has come from a place that you don't understand, and the pressure is put upon the new kid at school to explicate themselves, to justify themselves. And she could try to do that, but how is she going to explain to them that she actually has never seen a bicycle before? That she doesn't know what she has no idea, for instance, what some of the food that they're eating means, because she's used to mangoes and she's used to a certain tropical produce. So her attempt to explicate herself as the new kid at school eventually clashes with notions of empire and outsider, and I think it becomes very difficult.
She was pretty, not drop-dead gorgeous, but pretty, which would usually mean being accepted.
Yeah, she was pretty, but she wasn't pretty enough. I mean, you put it quite nicely. She wasn't pretty enough that you're going to overlook the fact that she had an accent, that she didn't seem to understand basic things about English life, that she was always cold because she came from a tropical climate. She'd never seen snow. A lot of things that you take for granted as a young girl growing up in England at the beginning of the 20th century were so absent from her vocabulary, from her understanding, that she would appear, I guess it's a somewhat pejorative word, but it's a word that would have been applicable to her. She was a kind of freak, and they would look at her and think, yeah, she's pretty, she's nice looking,
They disliked her voice for some reason.
They disliked
which led her to whisper.
They disliked her voice because the voice suggested difference. I mean, even to this day, kids don't like too much difference. In British society, one of the great hallmarks of belonging is your accent. So much so that, when Mrs. Thatcher, for instance, before they made her the leader of the Conservative Party, they made her have elocution lessons because she came from a rather lower middle class background, as daughter of a grocer. But the way she pronounced her words was regarded as an embarrassment to the Conservative Party. So even today, if you like, how you speak is a great signifier of the degree to which you can belong.
One of the people I knew when I was a student in England used to listen to Harold Macmillan records to learn to improve his accent.
Well,
he wanted to move up the social ladder.
Social ladder. Of course, I went to university as a northerner, as a guy from the north of England with
A Yorkshire accent.
Yeah, with a very, very strong Yorkshire accent, and with other kids, a few other kids, a handful of other kids with very strong northern accents. And I think, honestly, by the time we graduated, I was the only one who still had a northern accent, because it seemed to me, for me to change my accent wasn't going to solve the problem of belonging, so there was no point. But the other kids were doing the Harold Macmillan Records thing.
She, as we mentioned, worked as a chorus girl in musical comedies. Why didn't she stay with that if she wanted to be in show business?
Because she was not going to get promoted to the front row of the chorus, if you like, and then to an individual starring or co-starring or featured, I guess that's what you'd call it, a featured role, because her accent was going to mitigate against it. And I think a sense of pride, because you have to remember, if you come from the Caribbean as a white person, in the Caribbean society as a white person, you are of the upper echelon, because the vast majority of the population are black, and irrespective almost of your economic status, your skin makes you of the upper echelon in the Caribbean. If you come to England, your skin is not going to necessarily give you social elevation. So I think she understood that in England, race is always going to trump class.
She wound up depending financially and emotionally on various men. And do we know why all of her marriages, she had 3 marriages, were disastrous?
I think she chose men who were slightly more interesting than the kind of rather boring. The man that she fell in love with initially was a rather boring banker, a financial man, upper middle class, very privileged. But he rejected her because she was an exotic mongrel, as far as he was concerned. So I think she chose to gravitate towards people who seemed a little bit more like her, a bit more uncategorizable, and a little bit more open to the possibility of chaos, basically, in their lives.
Her second husband, literary agent Leslie Tilden Smith, suggested that she return to Dominica. What did he think would be gained by that?
Intimacy with her, by seeing where she comes from, perhaps some better understanding of who she was. I mean, if you marry a woman, or a man marries, or a woman marries a man who comes from another country on the other side of the world, perhaps, and things are going wrong between you, one of the ways of trying to solve or bridge that gap that's growing up between you is to see where they came from, to try to go back to the beginning and understand who they were before they met you.
Reese is often depicted as having been treated badly by men. Isn't she dismissive of that husband? You write that his intrinsic kindness annoyed her.
Well, again, she had been effectively dismissed once by a man who appeared to be kind and appeared to be dependable, but when the chips were down, he couldn't introduce her to his family. He couldn't imagine her as part of his family. So I don't think she wanted to be around. She didn't trust men who were kind or appeared to be kind. I think she wanted a kind of rogue and a bit of a rolling stone like herself.
You begin and end this novel with Reese going back to the island of Dominica, because that is a turning point in her life. Was she already writing by this time?
She was writing, but...
In fact, she published her first book when she was 37. I guess she went to Dominica when she was 45.
Yeah, so she'd been writing. I mean, she'd been writing for a good while, but the thing was that England wasn't becoming any kinder towards her. England wasn't becoming kinder towards her as a place which recognized her. But although she was writing and publishing books, England wasn't being kind towards her as a writer either, because the books were quickly going out of print. She was not as if she was earning large advances or she was a part of the Bloomsbury group or anything. She was always seen as a bit of an outsider. So I think the desire to go home at that time was a desire to reconnect with something that would nourish her in a more elemental way.
When we look at those earlier novels, some of which have become classics, we realize she probably was ahead of her time. Her style might not have appealed to readers of that time, but appealed to readers today.
I think she was definitely ahead of her time. I think when we look back on those novels, we're watching the work unfold of a great 20th century writer of modernism, a person as great as Virginia Woolf, but who didn't have the social connections of a Virginia Woolf, who didn't have the cachet in her time or after her time that would ground her in the canon. She was an immigrant.
But she did have a connection to a prominent writer. You don't include her relationship with the great English writer Ford Madox Ford in this book.
No, she had a relationship with Ford Madox Ford in Paris in the early 20s. Ford Madox Ford...
That's after he'd already written his masterpiece, The Good Soldier.
Yes, yeah. I think that's 1921 or around about then. He met Rees round about that time, 21, 22. He encouraged her to write. He tried to help her make connections with publishers. Along the way, he slept with her, too. But I don't think he was... I mean, they eventually fell out very badly and had a very hostile relationship. But I don't regard him as being more than a sort of mentor in the sense of making connections. Emotionally, he wasn't able to do much for her.
He kind of taught her how to channel her experiences into publishable prose.
Yes, yeah.
Because he was a semi-autobiographical writer, not with The Good Soldier, but with his other famous book,
exactly.
Parade's End.
Yeah.
And he really was on top of things. He was the editor of the Transatlantic Review, which was publishing Hemingway, Joyce, Stein. And he encouraged her to change her name to Jean Rees. Not surprising, because he had changed his name from Ford Herman Herfer to Ford Madox Ford.
Yeah, he was... Well, exactly. I mean, he guided her as a mentor through the, up the lower slope, shall we say, of an early literary career, trying to encourage her where to publish, how to revise, how to make money and still write, all of the things that are still important today. He did that for her. The fact that he was sleeping with her, she wasn't the only young thing that he was sleeping with. So she was not naive about this. But he was a mentor and he was important. But emotionally, given the emotional texture of her life, which, to be honest, is what I'm trying to get at in this novel, rather than Jean Rees as a writer, I'm interested in Jean Rees, the person.
But still, you probably learned a lot about her life from reading books. For example, she wrote about her affair with Ford in a 1928 novel called Quartet. And I suspect that she revealed a lot about the workings of her own mind.
Oh, sure. But, I mean, the thing about a novel is it's fiction. So a novelist is never going to tell you the truth in fiction. They will tell you
this
part
is an
of the
admission
truth.
by a novelist.
Oh. The novelist, if you want to know about a novelist, don't read their fiction.
Uh-huh.
Try and find their letters, try and find their diaries, try and find their journals. Don't read their fiction because it's constructed and it's already obfuscating the truth. It is absolutely true that Jean Rees's fiction covers a lot of autobiographical terrain, but you will only learn what Jean Rees wants you to know about Jean Rees in her fiction.
She published a number of books in the 30s after leaving Mr. Mackenzie, Voyage in the Dark, Good Morning Midnight, all semi-autobiographical.
All semi-autobiographical, yes.
And you said they didn't sell well. Did any critics like what she was doing?
They regarded them as very gloomy books.
Weren't they?
Yes, they were gloomy, but they were books about what it was like to be a woman, who didn't have an independent income at a time when women had only just got the vote. Women didn't have many rights. I mean, you couldn't petition for divorce, and if you did get divorced, you were not going to get money from your husband. You probably were not going to get custody of the children. So women were still, in that period of the 20s and the 30s, pre-Second World War, in a very precarious position in terms of self-determination. So they were gloomy because that's what they were dealing with.
I'm speaking with Caryl Phillips, whose latest novel is A View of the Empire at Sunset, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. After a long period of not publishing, Jean Rees, spelled differently, by the way, when her real name was Rees, but Ford Maddox Ford got her to call herself Jean, Jeanrhys. She wrote Wide Sargasso Sea in 1966, and that book was well received.
Very well received. It's a book she'd been trying to write since the 1930s, but she couldn't complete it because she fell into great poverty. And as you say, she spent a period of time incarcerated.
She was an alcoholic.
She was an alcoholic. I mean, she is a very, very difficult passage. So she couldn't write. I mean, she didn't have the circumstances that would enable her to get to a desk. She was more concerned with eating, finding a roof over her head. But she did in the 1950s find, she was discovered or rediscovered and given some support which enabled her, it took her another 10 years to finish the novel.
And do we know why she decided to write a prequel to Jane Eyre?
I think the subject matter is quintessentially classic Jean Rees territory. It's about the perception of what I prefer to think of when people say mad people. I prefer to think of them as people with an excess of subjectivity, people who've lost the checks and balances on society and are behaving in a way which is sometimes scary to other people. I think that's how Jean Rees was behaving for a great portion of her life.
And generations of readers have identified with Jane Eyre, the plain but intelligent and determinably feminist heroine of Charlotte Bronte's novel from 1847. In the novel, Mr. Rochester keeps his first wife, Bertha Mason, locked in the attic for years. Before Rees, had anyone conjectured about Bertha except as an impediment to Jane Eyre's happiness?
No, but I think the fact that there was a Caribbean connection and there was an acting out, if you like, a sort of, that, as I said, an excess of subjectivity that was making her behave in a way that appeared to English people to be unacceptable and strange, I'm sure registered with her because that's how people perceived of her, Jean Rees.
Bertha was a Creole woman who was rejected by her husband and goes on to destroy herself. So there definitely, you can see the connections there. When she reimagines the character of Bertha in Wide Sargasso Sea, she gives her a different name, Antoinette Cosway. What's the significance of the name change? Well,
I think it's the same significance as going from Gwen Williams to Jean Rees. I mean, it's the same significance as going from Elaine Potter to Jamaica Kincaid. You know, I mean, Caribbean people have always done this. They cross the water, they change their name, whether they're writers or whether they're musicians. It's an act of reinvention and playing with the English language.
How does Rees explain the reasons her heroine loses her mind? Is that something that's autobiographical as well?
I don't think she can ever fully explain what's happening when characters, and I think you're right, lose their mind, lose their way, lose their bearings, lose their footings. But she's trying to suggest I think in novel after novel after novel, how easy and precarious life is, that we think we're on terra firma and we don't realize how close we are to slippage. It can be imposed upon us by outside forces for reasons that are totally beyond our control, and then we're just reacting. In her case, it's most traditionally done through the prism of some man who has reeled her in and then lets her go without any warning.
In Bronte's novel, Mr. Rochester is moody and a bit haughty, but definitely an appropriate match for Jane Eyre. Isn't Rhys's portrayal of him less flattering? He's unfaithful and emotionally abusive.
Well, she's rewriting the canon from the inside. It's like the people who have reapproached Robinson Crusoe, for instance. They've never presented the same Crusoe that Daniel Defoe did, because from their point of view, he becomes a slightly less benevolent, nice Christian geezer who's just saying, you're called Man Friday because I found you on a Friday and everything's cool, my brother. What they're basically trying to say is, from my point of view, as somebody who is closer to Friday, this geezer is toxic. So it just depends what point of view you're taking. There's no way that a person who's born and grown up in the Caribbean is going to look at Mr. Rochester through benevolent eyes.
As we said, Wide Sargasso Sea was a big success, but Rhys said that her literary fame had come too late.
Mm-hmm.
She felt she was kind of at the end of her life. She still had years to go.
It had come too late. In some ways, though, I think it's good for writers if it comes too late. I think it's good if it never comes, because it often it throws people into a state of high anxiety and too much aware of their imagined status. So I'm not sure that if she'd have achieved literary fame in the 1930s with those terrific modernist novels that she was writing, from Quartet right through, After Leaving Mr. Mackenzie and Voyage in the Dark and Good Morning Midnight, if those had been much more successful novels, both critically and in terms of finances, I'm not sure we'd have had Wide Sargasso Sea. So it's hard to wish somebody to suffer the things she suffered in order to have Wide Sargasso Sea, but yes, it came too late. But you know what? We have the evidence of a remarkable novel towards the end of her life.
Isn't there another Bronte connection between you and Rhys? Charlotte Bronte's sister Emily wrote only one novel, Wuthering Heights. Were you thinking about what Jean Rhys had done with Jane Eyre when you wrote your novel, The Lost Child, which was inspired by Wuthering Heights?
I was, because I had the idea for writing about Jean Rhys in some
Oh, you were already thinking about writing.
I was already thinking about it before I even started to write The Lost Child. So I was aware of Jean Rhys in the back of my mind. The truth is, I was thinking about writing a film about Jean Rhys. And so I was working with a film producer in England in about 2011, 2012, at the same stage as I was at the lowest slopes of trying to write The Lost Child, which is a novel which is kind of in conversation with Wuthering Heights. So at a certain point I realized that I was too interested in Jean Rhys for it to be a film. I wanted to have more intimacy with this character, so I stopped and then continued on my way with The Lost Child. And I think some of that canonical conversation with the Brontes toppled over into that book.
Although I think it would be interesting to have a film about Jean Rhys.
Oh, I'd love there to be a film about Jean Rhys. But it's, the thing about writing a film is you write the script and then other people take over. I mean, it's their job. The actors, the producers, the costume designers, the set designer, the director, the editor, they will then shape the story the way they want to shape it. And it's absolutely right. You should take a back seat. But if you feel a sense of passionate connection still, then you can't take a back seat. So I didn't want to release any of that to anybody else's interpretation.
Emily Bronte described her hero Heathcliff as a dark-skinned gypsy who was adopted by the owner of Wuthering Heights, but you portrayed him in The Lost Child as the out-of-wedlock son of the owner and former slave. Why do you think British novelists like the Brontes fail to deal honestly and openly with issues of race? Was it intentional, or are they just totally oblivious to them?
Strangely enough, I think the Brontes, more than most, were aware of race. I think they were aware of the complexities of the slave trade. I mean, the father in Wuthering Heights goes to Liverpool, which is the biggest slave import in Europe, and finds his dark-skinned child on the docks. I mean, I think the Brontes are, as far as Emily Bronte is able to, I think she's suggesting a connection with slavery. Her sister Charlotte in Jane Eyre is dealing with the Caribbean and the colonial world. So I think they're aware, but they're not able to open up about race in the way in which American writers, either of the 19th or the 20th century, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wow, bam, let's just deal with it.
Britain didn't have open slavery, although there were slaves in Britain.
Well, exactly.
They were working the cotton plantations.
Yeah, it was a system whereby your slavery was exported offshore. There was no slavery per se in Britain. If a slave ran away from a plantation, got on a ship and arrived in Britain, they were nominally free. Slavery was something that happened away from Britain.
Although you could travel with your slave and nobody would say anything.
Well, if you arrived with your slave in England, in Bristol or London or wherever in 1810, nobody was going to say to you, "Excuse me, sir, why are you treating that young Negro boy in such a heinous manner?" They're just going to accept it as that's what goes on. So obviously there's an element of slippage around this definition of freedom for black people in England.
Getting back to Jean Rhys in your novel, she is asked at one point if she's English, and she says, "Well, I suppose I've tried to be, but no."
Mm.
Do we know whether Rhys actually considered herself to be English? She spent the last 20 years of her life actually working on an autobiography, didn't she?
Yeah. Did she consider herself to be English? That's a very good question. I don't think she ever did. I think she always considered herself to be a West Indian. England was a great disappointment to her, as it is to many migrants to this day. Rightly or wrongly, it was a disappointment, but it was a disappointment to her.
You live and teach in the United States, so do you identify at all as British, or are
Sure,
you now?
I'm a Brit.
You never got American citizenship?
I have an American passport too, but I'm a Brit. As I get older now, and having taught in this country for nearly 30 years, of course I have an American passport, I have a British passport. It becomes a matter of sensibility. It becomes a matter of what newspaper you read first in the morning. Do you read the New York Times online, or do you read the Guardian? I read the Guardian. Do I look for the results of the Yankees or the Jets, or do I look for the results of Leeds United? I look for the results of Leeds United. It's my sensibility is formed by the country in which I grew up, where I learned to speak the language, where I learned to read and write, and where I was first defined as the other in some pretty pejorative terms. That's where my problems lie. Do I care about the United States? Of course I do. And I've written about the United States, and I'll continue to care. But I'm fundamentally a Brit.
But being treated as the other, don't you think to some degree that helped form you as a writer?
I think being treated as the other helps form
I'm not saying people should be picked on so that they can become better writers.
Writers are people, you know this probably better than most journalists in the United States, having interviewed so many writers.
I have a brother who's a writer.
Well, of course, Philip. Well, I don't know how Philip would answer this question, but the truth of the matter is, writers are generally people who have been picked upon, who didn't have happy childhoods to some degree.
Me. I should have been the writer.
What do you mean you should? There's plenty of time, Lenny. But writers do not grow up with what I think of as Swiss childhoods. Mm-hmm. Writers grow up with slightly dysfunctional childhoods, and that dysfunctionality can be around race, class, gender, sexuality, but there's always some little agent there in their background which has made them think of themselves and their relationship to the world has been slightly out of tune to some degree.
I wonder about the last years of her life. She spent the last 20 years in a small village in Devon that she once described as a dull spot which even drink can't enliven much. Why did she decide to stay in England? She'd spent some time on the continent, and of course she could have always gone back to the Caribbean.
She didn't have the money.
Really, even after the publication of a best-selling book?
She didn't have the money. She didn't have the support system. I mean, the Dominica that she would have gone back to after 1966, when she published the novel, and she did get a little bit of money, not enough money actually to have been able to retire comfortably. Not near, she still was very dependent upon, as Tennessee Williams might say, the kindness of strangers. She was very dependent.
Her estate probably has done very well since. Her estate has probably done very well. She wrote one of the classics of British literature.
That, I'm afraid, is the legacy of so many writers who died not doing so well, and suddenly, Baldwin is a classic case of that. When Baldwin died in 1987, there was not a lot of excess money floating around, but you become canonically embalmed, your sales rocket, they make movies of your work, and suddenly there's a lot of money in the estate. So I think it's true with Jean Rhys, but she didn't have the money to make a comfortable return to the Caribbean.
When she died in 1979 at the age of 88, how far along was she in writing her autobiography, which has been published posthumously under the title Smile, Please, an unfinished autobiography? I think that's an interesting title for Jean Rhys.
Yeah, I think she didn't have the energy or the will to continue with the biography. Obviously, she was ailing, but she'd said what she wanted to say about herself, as much as she was able to say about herself, I think, in the fiction. As we've already, talked about a little bit, her fiction is very thinly disguised autobiography in some places. So I think that she felt she was retreading old ground. So, the person that was working with her on the biography, is a former Columbia University professor who lives in New York still, David Plant. And I think one gets a sense from reading his essay about working with Jean Rhys on this autobiography, that she was far more interested when he turned up with his notebook far more interested in what bottle of vermouth he'd brought with him, or whether it was a nice bottle of champagne they were going to drink today. I don't think she was motivated, shall we say.
She was a woman who took money from men for sex, and at one very low point in her life, she allowed past lovers to carry on financing for her long after they had left her. Is she open about all of that in the autobiography?
No, because we don't really get that far into what we might regard as the descent into the dark years. The autobiography covers in quite some detail the childhood in Dominica, growing up in Dominica, the initial movement to England at 16. But the real difficult, problematic years, in which you absolutely correctly say she was taking money for sex, she was drinking excessively, she was kind of out of control, are not really covered.
And she probably wouldn't have even had the final success if a writer and actress named Selma Vaz Diaz hadn't placed an ad in a newspaper looking for her. She wanted to adapt some of Reese's work for the BBC. And also an editor, Francis Wyndham, wanted more work from her. She told him that she was working on this novel called Wide Sargasso Sea, and she couldn't be bothered.
Well, I mean, by this stage, the people thought she was dead, actually. Mm-hmm. That's why Selma placed the ad, because they needed to find the estate to get the rights to do this BBC adaptation of her novel. And they had assumed, because nobody had heard of her for years, that she was dead. She saw the ad and, quite rightly wanted to protest the fact that she was actually alive. But by then, her energy, her desire to write, her impetus to be a literary figure had gone. And it was largely Francis Wyndham, who was a very distinguished publisher, editor rather, and short story writer himself. It's largely through his efforts that he rekindled in her the desire to write.
What happened to her children?
She had one child who was brought up in Holland, and she's dead now, but that child, Mary Yvonne, had a daughter who I spent quite a bit of time with in Paris earlier this year. She's a lawyer. She's in her late 60s. She's Jean Reese's granddaughter, and she's the person in charge of the estate and in charge of her affairs to this day.
So she gave you access to letters and
things?
things?
No, because I was writing fiction. I never met her. I'd finished the novel. Mm-hmm. So the novel was actually launched in Paris in June at a big Jean Reese conference at the Sorbonne, by which time I had obviously said whatever I had to say about Jean Reese. Her granddaughter, obviously, who's a quite litigious lawyer, it was a little, the first meeting was a little fraught because I was worried what she might say, but she was very kind.
I was surprised when I wrote to you after I read this incredibly positive review in the New York Sunday Times of the book that you've just written, A View of the Empire at Sunset, that you were unaware that it even had happened. Don't your editors send you that kind of thing to make you feel good?
I was in Paris when you wrote to me. I was in Paris, and
I was saying congratulations.
Yes, you were, and it was very kind of you. But the other thing, though, Lenny, is I haven't read a review of a book of mine since 1987.
Oh, you want to read that review?
No, because if you read the nice things, then you have to read the ones where they say you're a jackass, right? So you can't have it one way and not the other way. So I decided a long time ago I would read nothing. Sitting in Paris, and I got an email from you saying, very kind, because people don't often do that, saying, congratulations, you've got this lovely review. And
there wasn't one negative word in it. I rarely read a review that doesn't say, but Phillips lets us down when he doesn't discuss that. Right. There was nothing like that in that review. It was all positive.
Well, that's good. One day I'm sitting on my porch with my glass of bourbon with my straw hat on in my dotage. I'll probably ask Farrar Straus to,
to give it to you.
Let me see that one.
I think you can just Google it. Right. And I'm always reluctant to ask a writer, are you at work at a new project, especially someone like you who, how many schools are you teaching at? You're at Yale?
No, I only teach at one school. I only teach at Yale, but this year I did a short session at Barnard, where I used to teach at Barnard before I went to Yale, and I have a great deal of affection for that school, so they asked me to do a series of lectures there, so I did that.
Meanwhile, we have this novel, which, as I pointed out, received a rave review in the Sunday Times Book Review. It's called A View of the Empire at Sunset, about the early life of Jean Reese, or a character based on Jean Reese, published by Farrar Straus and Giroux. And Caryl Phillips, thank you so much for being on our show today.
Thank you. It was fun.
And that brings us to the end of our show. My great thanks to Carol Phillips, to Deborah
Saturdays
Freeman,
at 4
who
and Tuesdays at
prepared
noon.
this segment, to
You can
Reggie
subscribe
Johnson,
to
who's
Leonard
at the
Lopate at
audio
Large
controls,
podcast on
and
iTunes
Charlie
and
Morrow,
by
who
clicking on Robin
composed
Hood
our
Radio's
theme music,
archive
and to
program
my
site,
producer, Jesse Lynch,
which is
who was at the audio
robinhoodradio.com.
controls today.
You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.